afternoon and welcome, dear viewers, dear listeners from NATO Headquarters here in Brussels. And welcome to this armchair conversation, which I think is a very eloquent way of talking about a podcast, because what I'm going to be doing today is hosting the NATO chief scientist, Dr. Bryan Wells. I'll introduce him in just a moment. But who am I? As your host, or at least your moderator, I'm Jamie Shea. It was my pleasure last year to host the podcast called NATO Through Time, which looked at NATO's rich history in its 75th anniversary year. I obviously want to make a plug for that, and I hope that many of you tuned in to that particular series. But we're not going to be looking at history today. We're going to be looking very much at NATO's present and future. Now, I believe our conversation with NATO's chief scientist today is very timely. All of you who follow NATO and the defence debate will hear a lot about defence spending and defence budgets, 2%, 3%, 5% of GDP. You'll hear a lot about ramping up military production. You'll hear a lot about resilience and civil defence, even sometimes conscription and national service. But to my mind, there is another dimension which is just as important in all of this, if not even more important, when it comes to guaranteeing NATO's security, its ability to protect its population successfully, and that is the science and technology piece of the puzzle. It's long been an axiom of NATO that its defence and deterrence rested on its science and technological edge. But is this the case today? Does NATO still have its science and technological edge? If it does, how does it preserve it? If it doesn't, how does it regain it? And where can science and technology really facilitate NATO's ability to fulfill its defensive mission? We all know, as students of history, that science and technology have so frequently been game changers in determining who prevailed in conflicts. Think of radar, for example, in World War II, or code breaking, or things like that. But it's also in a very fast-moving world in which scientific and technological developments seem to be happening ever faster and ever challenge. It's always there. And to take us through this complicated picture, I'm delighted to welcome a friend and somebody it's been my privilege to have interacted with in the past, Dr. Bryan Wells from the UK. He's had this very interesting job title, NATO Chief Scientist, for the last 6 years. So, Bryan, thank you very much. Welcome to this armchair conversation. Really looking forward to our discussion. I know that you're going to give me and the audience many valuable insights. But before we get to the sort of the details of science and technology and the challenges, I think the audience would like to know, who is Bryan Wells, Dr. Bryan Wells? You know, what's your background? How did you get into this business in the first place? What made you want to become a scientist? So could you sort of give us a little bit of a potted biography and tell us, what motivated you, what attracted you to science?
Thanks, Jamie. Let me start by saying that I was interested in astronomy from a very early age, and that developed into a wider interest in science as I went through the school system in the UK, and eventually I took up chemistry at Oxford. I actually stayed there for 10 years. I did undergraduate studies there, doctoral studies there, and then 3 years as a research fellow at Oxford. And then came the first of many sharp changes in my career. I went into the administrative civil service in the UK government, but not as a scientist, as a policy advisor, and I was undertaking that role in the UK Ministry of Defence. And I did a range of advice posts in the UK Ministry of Defence, including on NATO policy.
Could you be a scientist and a civil servant at the same time, or did you feel there was some kind of sort of contradiction or stretch in sort of covering those sort of two aspects, the research side and the administrative side?
I think you can. I think the scientific training brings a certain way of looking at the world. Other backgrounds are also valuable, but I think to have a mix of humanities graduates, for example, and science graduates in the civil service. That adds a particularly rich mix at the senior levels.
Yeah, that was sort of C.P. Snow and the two cultures, I remember, from
Yes,
my
indeed.
own sort of university years. You need both, but how do you make them work harmoniously together? Maybe we could come back to that in a moment. But of course, you're here at NATO. You've been an international public servant for the past 6 years. So how did you end up at NATO? Was it accident or design? Was it? You mentioned that you dealt with NATO policy in the UK Ministry of Defence. So was it sort of a logical next step? Did somebody sort of tell you that you had to be in Brussels on Monday and give you no choice, or was it something that particularly attracted you? For which reasons would NATO have been attractive for you?
So it was a sharp change in my career. One of the jobs I did back in the UK Ministry of Defence was, in fact, going back to science and as a science policy advisor. And one of the duties of that post was to be the UK principal on the NATO Science and Technology Board. So that was my introduction into NATO. And then in 2019, there was another sharp change in my career because I was chosen by the NATO Science and Technology Board to be its chair and hence the NATO chief scientist.
Right. So it was a kind of mixture of circumstances, but also something that you clearly were aiming at, given that you had all of this background with NATO before. But even if you've had a lot of experience in the national public service, which you obviously had, was it still sort of strange turning up here at NATO headquarters? Now, of course, today with 32 countries to deal with, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of committees, quite a complicated structure. Did you make the transition easily, or did you find certain aspects of NATO as an international organisation baffling?
I think the work of a scientific advisor is actually very similar in both national and international levels. And one of the pleasures of my post here is discussing my experiences with national scientific advisors. We're often working on the same topics, giving advice on artificial intelligence, in quantum, in space, and so on. And we all face the challenge of explaining ourselves and our work to non-specialist colleagues and leadership. And the way that NATO's science and technology works allows the S&T advisors in the nations to share their best practice with each other and also with me so that we can all be better at our jobs.
Yeah. But how do you sort of make sure that you got influence in the system? There are so many players. You've got the Secretary General, you've got Assistant Secretary Generals, you've got obviously the 32 ambassadors representing the allied nations, a lot of different committees, and a lot of people obviously trying to get the attention of the Secretary General for their particular sort of interest, whether defence planning or capabilities or cyber defence or I don't know what. So how do you, as the chief scientist, ensure that not only have you got a voice, but that voice is heard in the system? I think the audience would also be interested in any sort of anecdotes or experiences. You've been doing the job for 6 years, so you must have some that show maybe some obstacles or where you've been able to sort of exert influence and get people to pay attention to what you think is particularly important.
Yeah. So the NATO Science and Technology Board is unusual in that in all meetings the nations are represented by their capitals rather than the delegations. So it's then necessary for my office, the Office of the Chief Scientist, to interact with delegations and with NATO committees. The post of NATO Chief Scientist was actually only established in 2012, and so I believe we've come a long way in placing S&T on the radar screen. And I call this mainstreaming S&T in NATO headquarters. It's to demonstrate to leadership and committees how the S&T can help them. And it's not just high-tech capabilities, but it's in things like political military decision-making and strategic foresight activities, for example. I remember when I was a policy advisor in the Ministry of Defence, it didn't actually occur to me in some cases that scientific assistance could help in policy advice. And I'm slowly, but I hope surely, getting that message into the NATO bloodstream.
So is it really sort of a question of showing NATO's leadership how what you know can make their lives easier by using science and technology, not by saying we're going to change the system entirely and go in a different direction, but what science and technology can help you do the things that you're doing at the moment and need to do more efficiently and more effectively?
It's that, but it's also when I interact both with national leadership in the delegations and with NATO leadership here, it's to give them the reassurance that their lives are dominated by day-to-day decisions, the tomorrow, the today, and that there is an organisation that they can access who is looking 20 years ahead. And just giving that reassurance is of itself an important message into leadership.
Yeah, but do you think the system could be improved, particularly based on your experience? I remember in my younger days at NATO, going back a bit, we used to have a science committee.
Yes.
And then that I can't even remember exactly why, Brian. You probably could remember it better than me, why it suddenly disappeared. But, do you feel that NATO has the structures that it needs to handle scientific advice optimally? I mean, I know that you have access to science and technology organisation with facilities in Brussels, Paris, La Spezia, as you pointed out to me the other day. I'd forgotten about La Spezia, so thank you for reminding me there. You mentioned the Science and Technology Board. Are all the structures right, or do you think there is maybe still a missing link there?
NATO is a political military organisation. It's not a science and technology organisation.
That's
so
a fair point.
There are many organisations, including in this headquarters and elsewhere, that have scientific roles. There's the Science and Technology Organisation, but also colleagues in IHC in the hybrid cyber and information domains that have science and technology there, Science for Peace and Security, for example. Allied Command Transformation has a key role. So the Science and Technology Board is chartered to have a unified governance role on this, recognising that different players have different roles within this organisation.
Yeah. Does NATO sort of, in looking at the Science and Technology Organisation, does it sort of do its own internal research as an organisation? You do sort of original scientific research, or is it really a question of these people who work with you, work under you, looking at what's going on in the science world and ringing the bell when they come up with something significant, and then finding ways, as you do, to feed it into the NATO system so that policymakers who are not scientists, well, usually, focus on it and understand why it's important?
So we've got three entities within the Science and Technology Organisation. There's the Office of the Chief Scientist here in Brussels. We're about 15 staff strong, and the role of the office is to support me in my dual role as NATO Chief Scientist and Chair of the Science and Technology Board. We have the Centre for Maritime Research and Experimentation in La Spezia. That's about 150 scientists specialising not only in maritime science and particularly autonomous maritime science, but it's got active climate change programmes, active quantum programmes, and so on. And then in Paris, Collaboration Support Office runs what we call the Collaborative Programme of Work. This is a programme that's delivered by around 5,000 scientists and engineers across the globe, not only the 32 allies, but many of our partners as well, making very valuable contributions. At any one time, we've got about 400 projects underway, with a value of around about 400 million euros.
So this is quite a big structure.
Yeah.
You have to look after.
That's right. This body of scientists in both run out of Paris and run out of La Spezia produces reports. It can have symposium. It can have exploratory teams, and the advice that is delivered by the chief scientist draws very much on that body of work. We go back and have a very significant archive of previous research, and that informs the advice products that are produced by the NATO chief scientist. We can produce public release advice. We try to do that in a number of cases, such as chief scientist research reports. We've done public release reports on the science that underpins the integration of women into the armed services.
That's another good example of what you were saying earlier, of how science and technology can be used for sort of public policy things, and not just for technological advancement.
Exactly.
That's an interesting example.
It's a very... when NATO published its CBRN, Chemical, Biological, Radiological, Nuclear Defence Strategy at Madrid in 2022, that was underpinned by a scientific report into that committee.
I know that there's also a science and technology strategy. I remember with the first chief scientist, while I was still at NATO, working, although I'm not a scientist, but at least bureaucratically, on the first one. How useful is it to actually have a strategy? I mean, does it add value? Is it just another piece of paper? Does it add value? Does it sort of do something that you wouldn't be able to do if you didn't have a strategy? It'd be interesting to hear what the main elements of the strategy are, if it's not sort of classified at a level that makes that impossible in our conversation today. And I always like Winston Churchill's comment that strategies are very fine things, but one should occasionally look at the results. I'm sure you're familiar with that quotation. So do you think, as I said, in terms of results, that, as I said, having a strategy has been worth the effort that obviously goes into putting it together?
We're actually in the process of finalising a thorough revision of the 2018 NATO S&T strategy. And this revision takes as its starting point the 2022 strategic concept statement that technology is a key arena of global competition. Yeah. And the strategy adds colour to this notion. And in the strategy, we recognise that we need to anticipate and invest to prepare NATO for the future. We need to safeguard and protect our scientific knowledge, and we need to orchestrate and energise our cooperation. So this is quite unlike the 2018 strategy. It reflects the global competition, and I do believe that NATO needs a vision of what its science and technology ecosystem should be doing, and this strategy sets that out clearly. Implementation is the key.
As always.
And we have specific implementation goals. For example, to produce a NATO-wide research security policy for agreement in 2026. So that will be safeguarding and protecting our scientific knowledge.
I mean, NATO has a lot of partners, of course, including ones that obviously are very scientifically and technologically advanced. Think of Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, but others, of course, in Europe as well. Do they participate in this strategy? Do you look to them a lot for resources, for inputs, or are they very much involved in all of this? Would NATO be able to be so advanced if these partners, for example, were not partners of NATO? I think the audience would be interested, particularly those people who are actually in the partner countries themselves following our armchair conversation today, in what kind of contribution they make and what you think they get out of it, in terms of the benefit to them of cooperating with you.
So we have what we call S&T Enhanced Partners. That includes, as you have said, Australia, Japan, Korea, Switzerland. They participate significantly in our programme of work. And in doing so, I hope that they benefit from drawing on the wider resources of the scientific network. Let me give you an example. The average leverage that a nation gets by participating in the collaborative programme of work is about 1 to 10. So for every euro that they put in, they get 10 euros back of benefit.
That's a good deal.
That's a good deal.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the allies also benefit from having these partners participating. It's a different way of looking at the world, and that's how science progresses, by bringing the scientists together, having honourable and professional challenge of the scientific conclusions.
Yeah, the more inputs, the better the science, and the more reliable the science that you get at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Makes sense to me. Well, Bryan, we devoted the first part of our conversation today to your work, your role, how you go about your job, your interactions and the processes. I'd like now, in the second part of our conversation, to turn to the science and technology itself. I mean, I know that what our audience will be thinking of are things like emerging and disruptive technologies, artificial intelligence, which everybody, including me, is trying desperately to understand, even when it comes to the basics. What should we be looking at? Where are we good? Where are we bad? Where are the threats? Can we, use science and technology not just to give ourselves an advantage, but also to neutralise the ability of adversaries to use their science and technology against us. I mean, these are issues that I know you're grappling with. But just to start with the basics, it's always useful to have buzzwords like emerging and disruptive technologies. But I know from hearing your speeches that you're very good at explaining what we actually mean by these. So can you start by telling us what these are?
Yeah. So EDTs in this context are new technologies that can ensure that NATO retains its strategic dominance. And NATO has a public list of EDTs. It includes autonomy, artificial intelligence, quantum, space, energy storage, biotechnology, and many others. And many nations and organisations have produced their own set of EDTs for defence and security purposes, and there's a remarkable convergence on what EDTs for defence.
What should be on the list?
What should be on the list. Yeah. But also, I think it's really important that we reflect on how EDTs are different from the technologies of 20, 30 years ago. So first of all, our technology today is dominated by the private sector. Yeah. We've only got to think of the investments of Amazon, Tesla and others to recognise that the private sector drives technology change in a way that defence drove technology change, say, 30 years ago. This has completely changed, and the technology future is driven by the commercial sector. Secondly, it's combinations of EDTs that actually make the difference. And in this context, the combination of artificial intelligence, big data and autonomy is all-pervasive in defence. So intelligent, autonomous vehicles, for example. Next, we often talk about the pace of scientific change, and it's undoubtedly the case. But the breadth of science in defence is also important. We need the traditional physical scientists that we've always used in defence science, but we need social scientists, we need psychologists and so on to deal with the range of activities that modern defence science needs. And finally, you mention artificial intelligence. Scientifically, artificial intelligence is largely completed, and we're moving into the implementation and maturity.
I knew you were going to say that, because scientists often tell you that you're out of date because you guys, if I could use that expression, are already on to the next wave, aren't you, the next horizon?
And the next major scientific revolution, I think scientists generally predict, will be in synthetic biology.
Right, I'll ask you to say a word about that in a moment, but so many questions here, so little time. So on the emerging disruptive technologies, are there ones where, ticking boxes, you sort of give NATO an A, and to be frank, a C, hopefully not a D. In other words, areas where you feel the West in general, not just NATO, has advantages because we're open societies, we've got an innovative private sector, we've got good universities, we collaborate, so that the democratic system, if you like, produces the goods better than the autocracies that are among our adversaries and our competitors. Or are we, unfortunately, in a world where the autocracies are getting just as good at doing it as us, and therefore we may have a potential problem?
So regarding potential aggressors and strategic competitors, I'm concerned by all their advanced research. In a sense, the West has to stay still in this, and we retain our edge by the excellence of our knowledge base, our academic base, as you say. There are many ways of looking at the global ranking of our universities and our research institutes. However you measure them, the vast majority show the top universities are on the soil of allies or our partners. So that is where our excellence lies, and that is why there is such a emphasis in our new NATO S&T strategy on people, on making sure that we retain our excellent people. I should also say that regarding EDTs, we provide key advice into NATO through what we call technology trends. So every 2 years we produce S&T trends for leadership, which looks out over a 20-year time frame. We've just produced Science and Technology Trends 2025 to 2045, Volume 1, looking at macro trends. This is a publicly available document. So we look not so much at how the technology is changing, but what the geopolitical consequences of that. So we talk about evolving competition areas, we talk about the race for AI and quantum superiority, and we talk about the biotechnology revolution as well. So we've got significant work for leadership in this.
No, that sounds remarkably interesting. I suppose if I were a journalist, I'd ask you a snap question on this to say, if you're looking at the next edition of Technology Trends, and a journalist says, "What's the headline, Dr. Wells? From a geopolitical point of view, West needs more investment, West falling behind, or whatever." What sort of headline, from politicians sort of attempt to follow this and absorb it? What would be the headline that you would give?
I would say that the next revolution for defence and security is biotechnology. And the reason for that is quite simply the breadth of potential applications. We can all think of medical applications of biotechnology, which brings its own risks as well as its benefits. But biotechnology can be used to create novel materials, for example. If you combine that with 3D printing, you can have a game changer in forward operating bases. It's that sort of thing. The potential for biotechnology to develop new green fuels as well.
NATO obviously has had to go back to its primary collective defence mission since 2014, the first Russian invasion of Ukraine. How has that shift in sort of strategic emphasis, after years of doing stabilisation in the Balkans or Afghanistan, how's that sort of shift in emphasis influenced the work in your community? And Bryan, while you're answering, could I follow up with another question?
Yep.
Are NATO governments investing enough in research and science? There's all these worries, particularly at a time when budgets are under strain and, countries are running deficits. Is there a temptation to, thinking, well, that's about the future and, welfare spending, that's now. Is there a temptation to cut those budgets with terrible consequences for the future?
So looking at the lessons from Ukraine, my own takeaway here is that traditional warfare has not been replaced by new warfare. It's been added to. So we see tanks being used, we see artillery shells being needed.
That's right, in big quantities as
well.
big
quantities, but we also see drones, we see AI, we see novel sensing. The range of warfare has expanded, and I think it's the same with science and technology. We talk about the pace of science, but it's the breadth as well. To deal with all these different scenarios in warfare, we need the traditional physical scientists, we need social scientists to deal with all of the cyber misinformation, we need medics to deal with the issues there. So that is really my takeaway from lessons learned in Ukraine. So far as spending is concerned, frankly, I haven't seen evidence that the Allies are cutting defence research. All of the evidence suggests otherwise, that Allies recognise the importance of defence research and are, where they can, increasing that. Recognising that involves difficult decisions for all the Allies in terms of national priorities.
Understood. Well, that's good news, at least. I'm greatly reassured by what you tell me there, because I'm not a scientist, but I share your sense of how important all of this is. And, of course, some of these investments are multi-year, right?
Yeah,
so
yes.
you need to start now if you're going to reap the benefits in 10 or 20 years' time. You mentioned the private sector, and I know that in Ukraine as well, which you mentioned, the private sector is playing this incredibly important role. It now produces 50% of armaments in Ukraine. It's in the front line, upgrading drone countermeasures and drone jamming systems, literally real time, along with the soldiers in the trenches. How do you, in your own role as chief scientist, engage the private sector? I mean, do you sort of fly out to Silicon Valley to sort of sniff around and get a sense of what's happening? I mean, is it the private sector, is it interested in talking to NATO? I mean, they obviously want to make money. They want to produce their goods, their new social media platforms. But how does that dialogue take place? Because obviously, if they are producing the technology now, it must be important to have that dialogue.
It is, and it can take place on many levels. Whilst I don't fly out to Silicon Valley,
well, not every week.
Not
maybe.
every week. Yeah. Private sector companies are actually very open with, in my experience, with the chief scientist. We can set up video links. They talk to me about their work with no expectation of a sale out of it. This is pro bono. But we also have bodies like the NATO Industrial Advisory Group, which deliberately advises NATO not on a company-by-company basis, but as independent representatives of the industrial sector. They are invaluable in talking to us and identifying areas where we can collaborate more.
Okay. Innovation is another one of these buzzwords. Transformation as well. You mentioned we have a whole strategic command in Norfolk, Virginia devoted to transformation. But what does innovation mean for you in terms of NATO and your job? Do you think that NATO grips innovation well? Are we on top of it, or are we sort of chasing, 1 mile behind it? I know that some of the audience who follow NATO regularly would have heard of Project Diana, the Defence Innovation Accelerator. If I've got it right for the North Atlantic, please correct me if I've got it wrong. Thank God for that. Or the NATO Innovation Fund. Idea of centres being established on both sides of the Atlantic. Are there enough resources going into these sort of things to really make them game changers for NATO? And what are they doing? I think, again, the viewers and listeners would be interested in getting your take on all of that.
So let's look at Diana first. As you rightly say, the Defence Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic. This is really concerned with the transition from the science to actual production. So the science can be very difficult, but organisationally it's fairly straightforward. It's done in science labs, in collaboration, or by nations individually. Production, again, can be very complicated, but organisationally it's the private sector that are producing the capabilities. But the bit in the middle, the transition from the science to the production, is very expensive and it's very high risk.
Yeah.
We invariably find that innovations in the laboratory don't make it through initial test and evaluation. There's something that perhaps it's too fragile or along those lines. And we think back to the COVID days. One of the first vaccines had to be used at liquid nitrogen temperatures.
I remember that, yes. Now, the TV pictures of those incredible refrigerators.
Yeah. That was fine in a laboratory, but it wouldn't get
not commercially viable.
Not commercially viable, and it just wouldn't get used under those circumstances. So most of this transition is done in the nations, either individually or in collaboration. And that requires very significant investment because of the high risk and the expense. But Diana is a new tool in the toolbox. It's a multinational funded tool that, under certain circumstances, can be useful. Whilst its budget is small in comparison with the national budgets for doing this transition, it's an additional tool in the toolbox to do this. And if that works, then it will prove its worth. The NATO Innovation Fund is a venture capital fund to provide strategic investments. It's actually the world's first multi-sovereign venture capital fund. And many startups struggle because of the lengthy time to market timelines. The NATO Innovation Fund recognises that by saying to startups that it will be with them for the long term.
The seed money, as it were.
The seed money.
While they wait and get the big bucks, as it were, from the venture capital market to come in and invest.
Exactly. Again, it's a new tool. Yeah. So I think NATO has gripped the innovation challenge remarkably well.
First signs look promising.
Yeah.
Okay. Brian, but in the time we have left, there are two final things I want to ask you. One thing is that, again, back in the days when I had the good fortune to be on the NATO international staff like you, I remember a NATO ambassador, won't name him, but he was a very bright NATO ambassador, talking about a sort of digital divide in NATO. Yeah. He was worried that, this is a couple of years ago, as NATO was having to modernise its forces and upgrade them, there were those allies who had invested in the new technologies, whether cyber, hypersonic missiles, all the things that you know much better than I, who had sort of basically got it. They'd made the investments, they got the systems, they knew how to use them, while others were still on analogue. They hadn't really transferred to digital, they hadn't made the investments, they didn't really understand the importance, and that therefore, in the long run, this could be bad for NATO politically, because it would mean, interoperability would become difficult. People would start complaining about burden sharing. Why do I have to do this for you and you can't help me because you're 20 years behind me, sort of thing. 10 years later, more or less, is this something that is still there? Did it ever really exist? Is it something that you think your own efforts can help to overcome this divide? And NATO is sort of, there'll always be countries more advanced than others, of course. Some militaries, will have things that other militaries don't. But is NATO becoming an alliance where science and technology is becoming more evenly sort of shared?
Yep, I think interoperability is the key here. Different equipments have always existed, but they need to be able to talk to each other. That's the key to interoperability. And I do think that the Science and Technology Organisation has a vital role to play. If the allies collaborate together on the science and technology at an early stage, then the interoperability is then baked in from the beginning. And that provides the basis for interoperable equipment. If the divide is increasing, and we can have a debate about that, we must recognise that we have other tools now to enhance interoperability. I'm thinking here particularly of AI as a tool to allow different equipments to talk to each other and to interoperate. So I do think that the NATO chief scientist has an important role in encouraging the nations to do the science collaboratively so that the interoperability is baked in right from the start.
Right. Well, as I drove here earlier, I went past the other big beast in Brussels, of course, in terms of institutions, which of course is the European Union. And of course, as you know, there's a lot of activity now taking place in the EU, also on security and defence. It's much higher up on their agenda today than it was a few years ago. You, like me, read in the newspapers reports that the EU is now going to sort of come up with a lot more money. 800 billion euros have been mentioned to invest in security defence, common funding of programmes and equipment, loans for defence projects and all of the rest. And the EU, of course, also is interested in the things that you've been speaking about, making Europe more competitive, developing the advanced technologies, funding research, development. It also has its own European Defence Fund. Sometimes the resources are bigger than the ones that NATO has, at least the common funded resources. So is this something that you're able to sort of piggyback on, or at least take advantage of, avoid duplication, or at least partner with the EU? Because we're all working for the same objective, right? Yeah. We're the same countries, mainly. We want the same things. We want to live in peace, security, freedom and democracy. We want to make sure that we're well protected and our civilizations is well protected, our populations, not just our frontiers. So how do you sort of interact with your counterparts? Is there a chief scientist over in the European Commission? Maybe many, but how do you interact with the people over there? And is it going as you would like it to go, given the urgency of the priorities and the funds that are potentially available?
Yep. So overall, I entirely agree that the changed political environment calls for enhanced NATO-EU cooperation at the strategic level. Let us think of our national and collective resilience, for example. That requires civil society and the military to work together. And the Washington summit announced that NATO defence planning will include civil planning as well, again to enhance national and collective resilience. If we think of troop movements to enhance NATO's deterrence and defence on the eastern borders, that requires troops to move through different EU member states. So mobility, again, mobility is required. And this is true also in science and technology. So there's strong cooperation with the Directorate General for Research and Innovation, with the Director General of the Joint Research Council, and also, as you've indicated already, the Director General for Defence Industry and Space. The key here is to be transparent, and that's my role on that. There's strong overlap, as you mentioned, between NATO allies and EU member states, and I know from my experience that they will not pay twice for the same thing. Quite often when you see headlines of the topics that the two organisations are working on, they may even use the same words. If you dig into the detail, you'll find that they're actually doing different things. So I'm confident that we can avoid duplication.
Okay, that sounds good. It's good that at least that you're talking regularly and probably even more regularly. I've got a final question for you. Sorry, a trick I'm playing on you, because I've got one last thing to ask you before we release you back to your important activities, which is, when I was at NATO, if you were a senior official, as you are, in your last days in office, you'd get a phone call from the SecGen's staff and say, right, come up, and the SecGen wants to say goodbye and thank you for your efforts. And I had that experience myself, and I hope that Mark Rutte, the current NATO Secretary-General, continues that good practice. And I remember Secretary-General Stoltenberg said to me two things. He said, basically, in your job, what have you been able to get done? And number two, when I meet your successor, what do I tell her or him that she or he should be focusing on? Because that's the next sort of big thing that we have to get done. So not an easy question for you at the end, but I know you're going to give me a good answer. But when you have that, which I hope you will have, that sort of debrief with the NATO Secretary General, or at least the senior leadership, what are you going to say about, well, I managed to get this done? It's not a question of bragging or boasting, but, we managed collectively to at least, move the can down the road here. But, as far as my successor is concerned, this is what the focus has to be.
So my number one priority has been to mainstream science and technology in the NATO headquarters, to demonstrate to leadership and committees how science and technology can help them. And it's not just high-tech capabilities, it's political military decision-making,
this
leadership,
is an interesting thing,
and strategic foresight activities. And I believe I've been successful in that. It's also been a great pleasure working with the S&T professionals in the network. They do really great work, and I'm encouraging new S&T professionals into the network as well. What are the key challenges moving forward? Science is evolving all the time. We need to be watching its developments, and we've got a huge forward agenda on how to respond to the changing S&T ecosystem. My successor's been appointed, and he's already on the case.
Oh, that's good. So at least you're going to have overlap, which is always better than underlap. Well, Dr. Bryan Wells, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for sharing your time, but more importantly, your brain and all of your good insights with us. You've certainly helped to mainstream science and technology as far as I'm concerned, and I'm sure it's the case with our viewers and listeners as well. NATO may be losing you, but the good news, as you told me earlier, is that the scientific community is not losing you, because it would be a tragedy if it did, because obviously you could, with all of your experience and knowledge, you can carry on doing good things, which will help the Alliance as well. So, armchair conversation. We've had comfortable armchairs, but more importantly, stimulating conversation. Wish you all the best for the future. Hope we'll stay in touch, not only in meeting in Eurostar lounges in Brussels and London, and all the best, of course, to your successor. And I'd like to thank not just you, but the team here in the NATO Public Diplomacy Division who have helped us to put this on today. Your own staff who have been very kind working with me. Thank you very much to them as well. And dear viewers and listeners, I hope again that you have enjoyed the experience as much as I have. And from NATO headquarters here in Brussels, goodbye for now.